I gave my first time to a nameless, masked stranger in the shadows of the mating ball, then fled into the freezing night. I thought it was a secret I would take to my grave. I had absolutely no idea the towering man I abandoned was the ruthless Alpha King, until his army locked down the entire city just to hunt me down. Welcome to Luna's Secret Library. On this channel, you can enjoy all sorts of romantic love stories. If you like my stories, please subscribe to my channel for more wonderful tales. The grand chandelier cast sharp, golden shadows across the ancient marble floor of the Moonfire estate. Tonight was the decennial mating ball, a sacred night where destinies were sealed in blood and moonlight. My name is Elena, and I stood near the edge of the heavy velvet curtains, breathing heavily inside my restrictive corset. At 19, I possessed a youthful beauty that often drew unwanted, predatory stares from the nobility. But beneath my fragile appearance burned a fiercely resilient spirit that had kept me alive through years of hardship. As an orphaned omega with absolutely no status, I was strictly forbidden from stepping onto the main dance floor. My only goal tonight was to survive the cruel games of the elite and escape back to my quarters unnoticed. Suddenly, the massive iron doors of the great hall slammed shut with a deafening, terrifying crash. A suffocating silence instantly shattered the elegant waltz music playing from the string orchestra. He emerged directly from the high-contrast darkness of the sweeping stone balcony archway. He was towering and fiercely muscular, his sheer physical presence dominating the air in the entire room. A stark, silver half-mask completely obscured the upper half of his face, leaving only a harsh, unforgiving jawline exposed. His hair was cut ruthlessly short, dark, and brutally neat against his deeply tanned skin. He wore a meticulously tailored military uniform that clung perfectly to his broad, imposing shoulders. Every sharp, chiseled feature of his lower face screamed of raw, unchecked authority and danger. The surrounding crowd violently parted for him, scattering backward like sheep fleeing an apex predator. I pressed my spine desperately against the cold stone wall, praying to blend seamlessly into the shadows. But his predatory, golden gaze locked directly onto me across the sprawling sea of masquerade masks. My heart hammered against my ribcage like a terrified, trapped bird fighting for its life. He crossed the vast ballroom in a few long, deeply purposeful strides that demanded absolute submission. The overwhelming scent of winter pine, burning embers, and pure dominance crashed over my heightened senses. He stopped mere inches away, his towering frame casting a massive, inescapable shadow over my much smaller body. "You," he growled, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that sent terrifying, electric shivers down my spine. I tried to look away, but his intense, suffocating aura held me entirely and helplessly captive. A gloved hand reached out, fingers calloused and impossibly strong, gently gripping my trembling chin. He tilted my face up to meet the piercing heat of his eyes hidden behind the cold silver metal. "You do not belong hiding in these dark corners, little wolf," he whispered fiercely against my lips. I swallowed hard, my fierce inner resilience violently battling the overwhelming biological instinct to kneel. "I do not belong to anyone," I snapped back, struggling to keep my voice steady and defiant. A low, dark chuckle rumbled deep within his broad chest, a sound that was both terrifying and utterly intoxicating. "We will see about that," he murmured, stepping so intensely close that there was absolutely no air left between us. Before I could even process the imminent danger, his mouth crashed down violently and hungrily onto mine. It was not a gentle, romantic kiss, it was a total, soul-consuming, absolute claiming of my very existence. The entire world around us instantly vanished into a dizzying blur of blinding heat and desperate need. My hands instinctively moved upward, desperately gripping the rigid lapels of his immaculate, stiff uniform. Beneath the perfectly tailored fabric, I could distinctly feel the rock-hard, unyielding muscles of his powerful chest. He tasted like impending danger, intoxicating supreme power, and an ancient magic I could not even begin to comprehend. Every single rational thought in my head was completely obliterated by the sheer, devastating force of his touch. He effortlessly swept me off my feet, carrying me seamlessly into the pitch-black alcove hidden behind the heavy drapes. The high-contrast moonlight violently sliced through the narrow stained glass window, illuminating only the sharp, cruel line of his jaw. I had never been kissed, never been touched with such possessive reverence, never known what it truly meant to burn alive. Tonight, in the forbidden, hidden shadows of the grand mating ball, I willingly surrendered my absolute innocence to this nameless stranger. His skin was scorching hot beneath his heavy clothes, his movements fiercely commanding yet surprisingly, agonizingly gentle. I gave myself completely, body and fractured soul, to the masked phantom in the tailored military suit. When the distant, ominous clock tower finally struck midnight, the heavy, hypnotic spell abruptly and painfully broke. Cold reality crashed back into my consciousness with the devastating force of a deadly winter avalanche. I violently pushed against his solid, broad chest, gasping for breath, absolutely terrified of my own reckless, forbidden surrender. His striking golden eyes widened in brief, stunned surprise as I desperately tore my body from his tightening embrace. I blindly grabbed the torn edges of my cheap silk dress and fled rapidly into the labyrinth of the cold stone corridors. I ran through the sprawling, ancient castle until my lungs burned with sheer agony, disappearing into the biting, unforgiving winter night. I truly thought I had just made the single most dangerous, irreversible mistake of my entirely miserable life. I had just given my sacred first time to a ruthless, nameless, masked stranger in the blinding dark. I had absolutely no idea that the magnificent, terrifying man I abandoned in the dark alcove was Julian. I had no idea I had just inadvertently mated with the supreme, undefeated Alpha King of the entire Northern Empire. And I had absolutely no idea that his furious roar was already shaking the castle, as he mobilized his army to hunt me down. My bare feet hit the jagged, frozen cobblestones with a rhythmic, desperate slapping sound that echoed through the empty alleyways. The freezing night air bit into my exposed skin, but the fire burning deep inside my veins was far more agonizing than the cold. Every breath I took felt like inhaling shattered glass, my lungs screaming for mercy as I sprinted away from the castle's golden glow. I didn't dare look back at the towering spires of the Moonfire estate, fearing I would see his massive shadow looming over the horizon. The scent of him, that intoxicating, dangerous mix of winter pine and ancient, smoldering embers, was literally clinging to my skin like a second layer. I reached the dilapidated tenement building in the outer district, my hands shaking so violently I could barely turn the rusted iron key. I scrambled up the rotting wooden stairs, my heart pounding against my ribs with the force of a heavy sledgehammer. Once inside my tiny, cramped attic room, I slammed the door shut and slid the heavy oak bolt into its place with a frantic click. I collapsed against the wood, sliding down to the floor as a single, hot tear of pure terror finally escaped my eye and tracked down my cheek. What have I done? I whispered into the suffocating darkness of the room, my voice trembling with the weight of my irreversible choice. I looked down at my torn silk dress, the fabric ruined and stained by the raw, unbridled passion of a man whose face I had never even truly seen. But I could still feel the phantom pressure of his large, calloused hands gripping my waist, pulling me into his hard, unyielding military chest. I stood up on shaky legs and approached the cracked, silvered mirror standing in the corner of the small room. The moonlight filtered through the grime-stained window, casting a pale, ghostly light over my youthful and terrified features. My lips were slightly swollen from his hungry, possessive kisses, and my neck bore a faint, darkening bruise where his teeth had grazed me. It was the mark of a predator, a claim laid by a man who moved with the absolute certainty of a god walking among mere mortals. I frantically stripped off the ruined finery, throwing the expensive silk into the small, dying embers of my fireplace to hide the evidence. I grabbed a rough washcloth and began to scrub my skin with freezing water, desperate to wash away every lingering trace of his dominance. But the more I scrubbed, the more the sense seemed to intensify, radiating from my very pores as if it were now part of my biology. Meanwhile, miles away in the grand ballroom of the estate, the atmosphere had shifted from celebratory to something deeply murderous and dark. Julian stood in the center of the alcove where we had shared our stolen moments, his tall frame vibrating with a silent, terrifying fury. His golden eyes were no longer just intense, they were glowing with the predatory light of a wolf who had just lost its most precious prize. He picked up the small, discarded silk shawl I had left behind in my haste, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the delicate fabric. He brought the material to his nose, inhaling deeply, his sharp jawline tightening as he recognized the unique, sweet scent of his fated mate. "Find her," he commanded, his voice a low, guttural growl that caused the elite guards standing nearby to drop to their knees in fear. "I want every gate locked, every bridge guarded, and every single soul in this city accounted for by dawn," he roared, the sound vibrating the stones. He didn't care about the laws of the nobility or the protocols of the mating ball, he only cared about the girl with the defiant eyes who had fled him. The heavy iron bells of the great cathedral began to toll, a slow, ominous sound that signaled a total lockdown of the Northern Empire's capital. I heard the first long, mournful howl of a wolf echoing from the castle heights, followed quickly by 100 more answering from the streets below. They were hunting me, not as a common criminal, but as the missing piece of their king's soul, a treasure they would never stop searching for. I pulled my threadbare nightgown tight around my body, huddled in the corner of my bed, watching the door as if it might explode at any second. Every shadow in the room seemed to shift and morph into his tall, muscular silhouette, his masked face haunting my every waking thought. I knew the soldiers would be at my door soon, their keen senses sniffing out the royal scent that I could never truly wash away from my blood. In the distance, the sound of heavy military boots began to march through the outer districts, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud sounding like a death knell. I looked at my reflection one last time and noticed a faint, shimmering golden pattern beginning to swirl beneath the skin of my collarbone. It was the mating bond, the ancient, magical tether that linked my destiny to the man who was currently tearing the world apart to find me. He was the Alpha King, the most powerful and ruthless shifter to ever walk the earth, and I was just an orphaned girl with no name and no protection. But as I felt the fierce resilience in my heart flare up once more, I realized I couldn't just sit here and wait for the inevitable capture. If he wanted me, he would have to find me in the labyrinth of the city, and I would fight every single step of the way to keep my freedom. The hunt had officially begun, and the King of the North would soon realize that his mate was not a submissive lamb, but a wolf with a spirit of fire. The heavy thud of a fist striking a door 3 houses down shattered the silence of the night, followed by the terrified screams of my neighbors. I grabbed a small dagger and a heavy cloak, my eyes narrowing as I prepared to vanish into the rafters of the city before the king's claws reached me. I had given him my first time, but I would not give him my life without a battle that would shake the foundations of his very throne. The air in the room suddenly grew heavy with the smell of winter pine, and I knew, with a sinking, terrifying certainty, that he was already close. He was the predator, I was the prey, and the moon was high enough to illuminate every single one of my desperate tracks in the snow. The frigid winter wind howled furiously through the narrow, twisting alleyways of the outer slum district, carrying the heavy scent of impending doom. I scrambled out of my small attic window just as the heavy oak door of my room violently splintered into a dozen jagged pieces. For heavily armed elite soldiers crashed into my tiny, miserable living space, their drawn silver swords gleaming dangerously in the dim moonlight. But I was already outside in the biting cold, my bare, bleeding hands gripping the freezing, snow-covered clay tiles of the steeply pitched roof. Every single muscle in my exhausted body screamed in sheer agony as I pulled myself higher into the freezing, unforgiving winter night. Far below me, the usually quiet, impoverished streets were suddenly flooded with the blinding, high-contrast glare of 100 blazing military torches. The king's ruthless guard had completely surrounded the entire tenement block, effectively cutting off every single visible escape route in the district. And then, I saw him step out from the deep, pitch-black shadows of the narrow cobblestone street, commanding absolute silence from his men. Julian, the supreme Alpha King, walked with a slow, terrifyingly deliberate grace that made the surrounding battle-hardened soldiers visibly flinch and bow. His impossibly broad, intensely muscular shoulders effortlessly parted the sea of armed men like a massive, unstoppable warship cutting through dark water. The harsh, flickering torchlight perfectly illuminated his ruthlessly short dark hair and the cruel, sharp, unforgiving angles of his cold silver half-mask. Even from this terrifying, dizzying height, the sheer, crushing weight of his dominant, predatory aura made it incredibly hard for me to breathe. He stopped directly beneath the crumbling building, tilting his magnificent head back to inhale the freezing winter air with brutal, terrifying precision. I pressed my trembling body completely flat against the freezing roof tiles, desperately praying to the moon goddess that he couldn't smell my terror. But the faint, swirling golden mark on my collarbone suddenly flared to life, burning my cold skin with an agonizing, white-hot intensity. It was the undeniable, ancient magic of the sacred mating bond, brutally betraying my exact hidden location to the monstrous predator standing below. His glowing, unnatural golden eyes snapped directly upward, instantly piercing through the dense, protective darkness to violently lock onto my shivering silhouette. A sinister, breathtakingly arrogant smirk slowly curved onto his perfect, chiseled lips as he finally found his beautiful, fiercely defiant missing prey. "There is nowhere you can hide from me, my little wolf," his deep, rumbling voice suddenly echoed directly inside my terrified mind through the bond. Absolute panic exploded violently in my chest, completely overriding my physical exhaustion and propelling me forward across the treacherous, slippery icy rooftops. I leaped recklessly across a terrifyingly wide gap between two crumbling buildings, my freezing, numb fingers barely catching the rusted edge of the opposite gutter. I hauled my aching body up, my ragged, desperate breath violently tearing at my lungs, and continued my chaotic sprint toward the towering outer city wall. I knew these miserable, dangerous rooftops better than anyone else, having used them to escape ruthless, violent debt collectors for many long years. But I was no longer running from weak, mortal men. I was running for my life from the most lethal, undefeated supernatural shifter in the Northern Empire. The deafening, explosive sound of shattering wooden crumbling brick echoed right behind me, and I realized with absolute, paralyzing horror that he was pursuing me himself. He didn't even bother using the internal stairs. His massive, incredibly muscular frame effortlessly scaled the vertical brick walls with terrifying, inhuman speed and raw power. I risked a quick, desperate glance over my freezing shoulder and saw him effortlessly vault onto the icy roof just a few buildings behind my position. The sheer, devastating physical power of his heavy landing cracked the thick clay tiles beneath his military boots, sending sharp debris raining down into the panicked streets. "Stop running right now," he roared aloud, the sheer, overwhelming dominant command in his alpha voice causing my shaking legs to momentarily buckle beneath me. I bit the sensitive inside of my cheek until I tasted hot metallic blood, deliberately using the sharp physical pain to violently break his terrifying mental compulsion. I threw my exhausted, battered body forward without hesitation, sliding dangerously down a steep, icy roof and dropping into a narrow, hidden, pitch-black smuggler's alley. The sheer, uncontrolled drop brutally jarred my fragile bones, but I couldn't stop moving, my deeply ingrained survival instincts screaming at me to disappear into the underground shadows. This was the ultimate blind spot of the entire slum district, an ancient, unmapped maze of underground tunnels used exclusively by the poorest outcasts of the empire. I squeezed desperately through a rusted, broken iron grate, dragging myself deep into the damp, completely lightless catacombs hidden safely beneath the frozen, snowy earth. The heavy, overwhelming scent of damp soil, rotting wood, and old rusted metal finally masked my sweet, betraying scent from the supernatural monsters hunting above. I huddled silently in the pitch-black darkness of the narrow tunnel, wrapping my bruised arms around my freezing knees to somehow stop my violent, uncontrollable shivering. Directly above me, I could hear the terrifyingly heavy, frustrated, and dangerous footsteps of the Alpha King furiously pacing directly over my fragile hidden location. His sudden, furious, bone-chilling roar of absolute, possessive rage shook the very foundations of the ancient city, vibrating the cold dirt walls around my trembling body. He had temporarily lost my scent in the complex underground labyrinth, but I knew with devastating, heartbreaking certainty that a wolf never truly abandons his designated hunt. My heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against my ribs, echoing loudly in the oppressive, suffocating silence of the damp subterranean passage. I pressed my cold, trembling hands tightly over my mouth, terrified that even the slight sound of my ragged breathing would somehow give my position away. Through the narrow, rusted slats of the grate above, a single, sharp sliver of high-contrast moonlight pierced the darkness, illuminating the freezing vapor of my breath. I could clearly picture his striking, short dark hair and those muscular, imposing shoulders casting a long, deadly shadow across the cobblestones just inches above my head. This deadly, terrifying game of supernatural hide-and-seek had only just begun, and I knew I had to survive this freezing night if I ever wanted to see the morning sun again. I was permanently trapped in the cold, unforgiving dark, hopelessly and eternally bound to a terrifying, obsessed ruler who would gladly tear the entire world apart just to claim me. The suffocating darkness of the smuggler's tunnel was thick with the foul stench of damp decay, but it was the only thing keeping me hidden from the Alpha King. I pressed my freezing, heavily bruised back against the cold earth wall, desperately willing my frantically beating heart to slow its terrifying, erratic rhythm. Above the thick layer of ground, the heavy, earth-shattering footsteps of Julian finally began to fade, moving further down the snowy cobblestone street as he expanded his furious search. A fragile, foolish spark of hope ignited deep within my exhausted chest, making me genuinely believe I might actually survive this freezing, nightmarish ordeal. But my brief, desperate moment of relief was violently shattered by the unmistakable sound of wet boots sloshing through the thick mud just a few feet deeper in the black tunnel. I immediately held my ragged breath, my numb, shaking fingers tightening fiercely around the cold iron hilt of the small dagger I had stolen from my cruel landlord. 3 towering, horribly disfigured men emerged from the pitch-black shadows, their scarred faces twisted into cruel, predatory grins as their glowing yellow eyes locked onto my shivering form. They were incredibly violent rogue wolves, permanently cast out from their former packs for unspeakable crimes, and they ruthlessly ruled the lawless underground maze of the outer slums. Well, what do we have here hiding like a frightened rabbit in the dirt? The largest, most scarred rogue sneered, his foul, decaying breath hitting my face like a physical blow. She smells exactly like expensive royal perfume, overwhelming terror, and something impossibly sweet, another mutated rogue muttered, taking a slow, deeply menacing step toward my cornered body. I slashed my heavy iron dagger blindly through the freezing subterranean air, the sharp blade catching the faint, high-contrast moonlight filtering through the rusted grate far above our heads. Stay back right now, or I swear to the moon goddess I will gut you right here in the dark. I warned fiercely, channeling every single ounce of my deeply ingrained resilience into my trembling voice. The brutal rogues merely laughed, a harsh, terrifyingly grating sound that echoed loudly off the dirt walls as they simultaneously lunged at me with raw, uncoordinated force. I fought back like a cornered, desperate wildcat, driving my sharp blade deeply into the thick shoulder of the first attacker and violently twisting my small body out of his massive, deadly grasp. But there were simply too many of them in the cramped space, and a massive, heavy hand suddenly wrapped tightly around my fragile throat, slamming me viciously against the hard tunnel wall. A sharp, intensely agonizing pain erupted across my pale cheek as the rogue's jagged, filthy claws roughly grazed my cold skin, drawing a single, bright drop of hot crimson blood. That single, tiny drop of spilled royal mate blood changed absolutely everything in a terrifying, world-shattering instant. The very second my warm blood touched the freezing, damp underground air, a deafening, monstrous roar of pure, apocalyptic fury completely obliterated the eerie silence of the impoverished slums. It was not merely the angry roar of a mortal man, nor even a normal alpha wolf, it was the catastrophic, earth-shaking sound of a supreme sovereign who had just physically sensed his fated mate bleeding. Before the cruel rogue holding my throat could even register the catastrophic, deadly shift in the atmosphere, the thick layer of frozen earth and stone directly above us violently exploded. A massive, terrifying shower of heavy cobblestones, shattered wooden beams, and freezing white snow rained down upon us as the ancient tunnel roof completely caved in from above. Through the massive, jagged hole torn into the earth, the blazing, high-contrast glare of 100 military torches poured fiercely into the previously pitch-black underground darkness. And descending directly through the falling, chaotic debris like a beautiful, merciless god of war was Julian, his striking, ruthlessly short dark hair catching the golden embers of the fiery torchlight. His impossibly strong, heavily muscular body hit the muddy floor of the tunnel with a devastating, explosive impact that literally sent a powerful shockwave through the cramped space. The terrified rogue wolves instantly dropped me, their previous cruel bravado completely evaporating into pure, unadulterated terror as they violently fell to their shaking knees. Julian didn't even bother to draw a silver weapon, he simply reached out with one massive, leather-gloved hand and effortlessly hoisted the largest rogue entirely off the ground by his thick neck. The horrifying, incredibly wet sound of forcefully snapping bone echoed loudly through the silent tunnel as the Alpha King ruthlessly disposed of the immediate threat without a single ounce of hesitation or mercy. The remaining two rogues frantically scrambled backward, whimpering pathetically like beaten dogs, but Julian's heavily armed elite guards were already dropping into the tunnel to permanently secure them. Julian completely ignored the violent, bloody chaos erupting around him, his glowing, intensely dominant golden eyes slowly turning to lock completely onto my bleeding, trembling, exhausted form. The sheer, absolute power radiating effortlessly from his towering, impeccably dressed athletic frame was so physically overwhelming that it violently forced the remaining air completely out of my burning lungs. He stepped slowly and purposefully toward me, his heavy military boots brutally crushing the fallen debris beneath his feet, closing the final, terrifying distance between the relentless hunter and his captured prey. "You have run far enough tonight, my beautiful, foolishly stubborn little wolf," he rumbled, his deep, incredibly gravelly voice sending dangerous, highly electric tremors straight down my spine. I tried desperately to scramble backward into the remaining shadows, but my utterly exhausted, battered body finally betrayed me, my weak, shaking legs violently collapsing into the freezing mud. Before my knees could even hit the filthy ground, his incredibly strong, impossibly warm arms swept me up, pulling my small frame flush against his rock-hard, fiercely protective chest. The intoxicating, intensely dominant scent of fresh winter pine and smoldering ancient embers completely wrapped around my overloaded senses, effortlessly short-circuiting my last desperate urge to flee. He gently raised one large, calloused finger to my injured cheek, softly wiping away the single drop of blood with a deeply possessive, consuming tenderness that completely terrified my rational mind. "I told you," he whispered darkly, his perfect, sharp lips grazing the highly sensitive skin of my freezing ear, "there is absolutely nowhere in this entire world you can hide from your king." The swirling, magical golden mating mark resting on my pale collarbone flared suddenly with a blinding, undeniable heat, fully reacting to his close proximity and his absolute, unyielding physical dominance. Every single nerve ending in my body screamed in fierce protest, but the ancient, unstoppable magic pulsing through our newly connected veins violently demanded my complete and utter surrender. I squeezed my tear-filled, exhausted eyes shut, feeling utterly defeated yet strangely safe, realizing with a heavy, sinking heart that my fierce, independent struggle for absolute freedom was officially over. I could clearly feel the steady, incredibly powerful, and deeply calming rhythm of his massive heartbeat pressing directly against my own terrified, frantic, and rapidly beating chest. He easily carried me out of the ruined underground tunnel, rising effortlessly back into the blinding glare of the waiting military torches and his entire kneeling, fiercely loyal army. He walked proudly through the frozen, devastated streets of the outer slums with the absolute, unquestioned authority of an emperor who had just successfully conquered a highly rebellious nation. The freezing, bitter winter wind howled aggressively around us, yet I felt absolutely no cold while entirely enveloped within the suffocating, intense heat of his massive, muscular embrace. I buried my face desperately into the crisp, warm collar of his meticulously tailored military uniform, submitting completely to the terrifying, magnetic, and completely unavoidable pull of our sacred bond. The violent, frantic hunt was decisively over, but as the Supreme Alpha King confidently carried his captured mate back to the imposing Moonfire estate, I knew my true, intoxicating captivity was only just beginning. The imposing iron gates of the Moonfire estate slammed violently shut behind us, permanently sealing my fate within the luxurious, terrifying fortress of the Alpha King. Julian carried my exhausted, shivering body through the sprawling, snow-covered courtyards without breaking his long, commanding, and heavily purposeful stride. He completely ignored the shocked, audible gasps of his elite midnight patrols as they immediately fell to their knees in absolute, terrifying submission. The blazing torches lining the ancient stone pathways cast high contrast, flickering shadows across his ruthlessly short dark hair and dangerously sharp jawline. I felt incredibly small and entirely inadequate pressed against the massive, rock-hard muscles of his broad, intimidating chest. My cheap, ruined clothes were covered in freezing mud and the foul, damp dirt of the smuggler's tunnel, visibly staining his immaculate, tailored military uniform. Yet, he held me with such fierce, possessive care, completely unfazed by the dirt, as if I were a priceless, fragile diamond he had just rescued from the ashes. We entered the grand, soaring foyer of the main castle, where the blinding light of a massive crystal chandelier instantly stung my tear-filled, exhausted eyes. Dozens of high-ranking nobles and beautifully dressed aristocratic wolves still lingered from the mating ball, their hushed conversations dying instantly into a deafening silence. I buried my face deeper into the warm, crisp collar of his heavy coat, deeply ashamed of my bruised, impoverished appearance under their cruel, judging stares. My king, an older, elegantly dressed female noble stepped forward, her perfectly painted lips curling into a sneer of pure, undisguised disgust as she looked at my muddy form. You bring a filthy, unranked stray from the outer slums into the sacred, ancient halls of our proud ancestors? The sheer, unbelievable audacity of her condescending question hung in the heavy, suffocating air like a drawn, highly poisoned blade. Julian stopped walking entirely, his massive, athletic frame going dangerously, terrifyingly still as a deadly silence engulfed the entire marble room. The previously comforting heat radiating effortlessly from his powerful body instantly turned to a freezing, apocalyptic chill that made my breath hitch in raw fear. He slowly turned his head to look directly at the aristocratic woman, his glowing golden eyes narrowing with absolute, lethal intent. You dare to speak of filth, Lady Alara, while standing in the very presence of your newly awakened Luna, his gravelly voice boomed, literally vibrating the expensive crystal glass above. A collective, horrified gasp rippled violently through the gathered crowd of elites, their arrogant, aristocratic faces draining entirely of color in a single second. She is a nameless orphan with absolutely no noble bloodline, the woman foolishly protested, taking a frightened, trembling step backward as Julian's monstrous, suffocating aura flooded the room. Her bloodline is entirely irrelevant because she is bound by the ancient magic of the moon goddess directly to my very soul, Julian roared, the sheer, devastating force of his alpha command forcing the woman roughly to her knees. She is my fated mate, the undisputed queen of the Northern Empire, and the absolute master of every single life standing in this room. He shifted his firm grip on my trembling body, holding me securely with one powerful, heavily muscled arm while raising his other gloved hand threateningly toward the kneeling crowd. Anyone who dares to look at her with disrespect, anyone who dares to question her sacred right to stand by my side, will answer personally to my claws. The absolute, terrifying devotion in his harsh words sent a wild, chaotic thrill of unprecedented warmth straight through my deeply battered, defensive heart. I had spent my entire, miserable 19 years of life being completely invisible, treated as nothing more than disposable garbage by the wealthy, powerful elite. And now, the most dangerous, feared man in the entire world was literally threatening to burn his own magnificent court to the ground just to aggressively protect my dignity. Julian didn't wait for their trembling, desperate apologies. He simply turned his impossibly broad shoulders and began climbing the sweeping grand staircase toward his private, heavily guarded chambers. He kicked the heavy oak doors of his inner sanctum open with a single, powerful thrust of his military boot, carrying me into a massive room dominated by deep reds and dark, rich mahogany. The warm, crackling fire in the massive stone hearth provided a stark, beautiful high-contrast glow against the otherwise shadowed, incredibly vast and intimidating bedroom. He gently laid my exhausted, aching body down onto the exact center of a massive, incredibly soft four-poster bed draped beautifully in expensive, thick winter furs. I immediately curled into a tight, defensive ball, pulling the thick, luxurious blankets up to my chin as my deeply ingrained survival instincts continued to war violently with my physical exhaustion. Julian slowly unbuttoned the stiff, ruined jacket of his military uniform, revealing the sheer, intimidating bulk of his heavily muscled torso clad only in a thin, sweat-dampened white undershirt. He walked calmly over to a gilded silver basin, pouring steaming hot water from a heavy iron pitcher and dipping a soft, pristine white cloth into the soothing warmth. When he returned directly to the bed, the mattress dipped significantly under his immense, heavy weight, his towering, imposing presence completely caging me in. I flinched automatically as his large, heavily calloused hand reached slowly toward my face, expecting the harsh, casual brutality I had known my entire tragic life. But his touch was agonizingly, impossibly gentle, his strong, rough fingers carefully brushing my tangled, dirty hair away from the small, stinging scratch on my pale cheek. He meticulously cleaned the dried blood from my skin, his glowing golden eyes entirely focused on the delicate task with a heartbreaking, terrifying level of intense, consuming reverence. "You are completely safe now, my beautiful, endlessly resilient Elena," he murmured softly, the harsh, gravelly edge of his commanding voice softening into something incredibly intimate and vulnerable. I stared up at his striking, ruggedly handsome face, the sharp, unforgiving angles of his strong jaw perfectly highlighted by the flickering, warm amber firelight. "I don't belong in this opulent, terrifying world of yours, Julian," I whispered brokenly, my voice cracking under the heavy, crushing weight of my profound insecurity and deeply rooted fear. "I am just a poor, broken girl who has spent her entire miserable life fighting merely to survive the brutal, unforgiving winter of the slums." He leaned down, pressing his warm, firm forehead gently against mine, the intoxicating, heavy scent of winter pine and dominance completely surrounding my overloaded senses. "You survived all of that pain so that you could eventually find your way back to me," he declared fiercely, his powerful words vibrating deeply into my very bones. "You are absolutely not broken, you are the strongest, most incredibly fierce woman I have ever encountered in all my long centuries of ruling this empire." He gently traced the faint, swirling golden mark resting on my collarbone, the magical bond flaring hotly beneath his fingertips, definitively and beautifully proving his possessive claim over my body and soul. "You may not have been born a royal, but you were absolutely born to be my equal, my partner, and my one and only true mate." I closed my exhausted eyes, a single, heavy tear escaping my thick lashes as the sheer, overwhelming reality of my new, inescapable existence finally settled deep into my weary soul. His large, impossibly warm hand slowly moved down to gently massage the painful, bruised muscles of my tired shoulders, effortlessly melting away years of accumulated tension and pure, unfiltered terror. I had never once allowed myself the simple, foolish luxury of relying on another living soul, knowing deep down that blind trust always inevitably led to devastating, fatal heartbreak. Yet, staring directly into the deep, blazing depths of his protective golden eyes, I physically felt my impenetrable, emotional defensive walls slowly beginning to crack and crumble into dust. He was a terrifying, highly lethal monster to the rest of the mortal world, but in the quiet, fire-lit, high-contrast shadows of this intimate room, he was entirely, utterly mine. I was no longer running frantically from the dangerous, masked phantom in the freezing dark. I was now permanently sleeping in the very den of the Northern Empire's deadliest apex predator. But as his warm, incredibly powerful arms wrapped securely around my trembling waist, pulling me safely against his solid, unyielding chest, a terrifying, highly sobering thought violently crossed my mind. The ruthless, highly prejudiced aristocrats would absolutely never accept an orphan slum girl as their sovereign queen, and they would surely try to assassinate me the very moment he looked away. Julian's fierce, deeply possessive love might have successfully saved my life from the freezing, merciless streets, but it had just painted a massive, deadly target directly on my fragile back. Tomorrow, I would have to face the vicious, scheming nobility of the Northern Empire, armed with absolutely nothing but my sharp wits and my unbroken, fiercely resilient spirit. But tonight, wrapped safely in the heavy, luxurious furs and the warm, absolute protection of my fated mate, I finally allowed myself to simply close my eyes and rest. The deadly storm of brutal royal politics and lethal pack rivalries was rapidly gathering just outside the thick, frost-covered glass windows of our towering, heavily guarded bedchamber. I drifted slowly into a deep, heavy, dreamless sleep, completely and entirely unaware of the dark, ancient, and highly dangerous secrets that Julian was still desperately hiding from me. The harsh, high-contrast morning sunlight sliced violently through the heavy velvet drapes, ripping me abruptly from my exhausted, dreamless sleep. I immediately opened my heavy eyes to see Julian standing by the massive stone fireplace, his towering, intensely muscular back completely rigid with dark tension. He was already fully dressed in his black, immaculate military uniform, the crisp, severe collar perfectly emphasizing the brutal neatness of his ruthlessly short hair. The deeply intoxicating scent of winter pine in the room was heavily laced with the sour, metallic tang of his barely concealed anxiety and rising anger. There has been a highly coordinated, violent rogue attack directly on the outer northern border, he grumbled, turning his striking, rugged face to look at me. I must leave the estate to personally brief the military generals, but I have stationed my most utterly loyal elite guard outside this very door. He crossed the vast room in 3 incredibly powerful strides, his heavy boots echoing loudly before he leaned down to press a fierce, desperate kiss against my lips. Do not open this door for absolutely anyone until I return, my beautiful Luna, he commanded softly, his glowing golden eyes swirling with deep, obsessive protection. I nodded mutely, watching with a hollow, sinking feeling in my chest as his massive, imposing frame disappeared through the heavy oak doors, leaving me entirely alone. The absolute, terrifying silence of the sprawling royal bedchamber quickly became incredibly suffocating, pressing down heavily on my deeply ingrained survival instincts. Less than 20 agonizingly slow minutes after his departure, the heavy iron lock on the main bedroom door clicked open with a sharp, terrifyingly deliberate sound. The door swung inward, casting a long, deeply ominous shadow across the pristine marble floor, completely blocking out the bright morning light from the hallway. It was not Julian's fiercely loyal elite guards stepping into the private sanctuary, but the arrogant, perfectly dressed Lady Alara from the grand foyer last night. Behind her imposing, sneering figure stood 3 towering, heavily armored palace guards, their unsheathed silver swords already dripping with a sickening, glowing green poison. Did you honestly believe the ancient, proud Northern Empire would simply allow a filthy street rat to sit upon our sacred throne? Alara spat, her eyes burning with pure malice. The king is temporarily blinded by a primal, biological urge, but I am here to permanently cure him of his devastating, highly embarrassing mistake. I didn't waste a single, precious second trying to foolishly reason with a vicious aristocrat who had already firmly decided I was nothing more than an insect to be crushed. My entire life in the unforgiving slums had thoroughly taught me that when a predator corners you in the dark, you do not beg, you immediately go for the throat. I violently kicked the heavy, expensive winter furs off my body, rolling rapidly across the massive bed just as the first poisoned silver blade violently pierced the mattress where my heart had been. I crashed heavily onto the cold stone floor, my bare feet immediately finding traction as I lunged desperately toward the gilded silver wash basin resting on the nearby oak table. The armored guard sneered, raising his lethal, poisoned weapon to strike my defenseless back, vastly underestimating the sheer, explosive speed of a starving alley cat. I grabbed the heavy iron pitcher with both shaking hands and viciously hurled the remaining boiling hot water directly into his exposed, unprotected face. The man dropped his sword with a deafening clatter, screaming in pure, blinding agony as the searing water blistered his skin, dropping heavily to his armored knees. "Kill her right now, you useless, pathetic fools!" Lady Alara shrieked from the safety of the doorway, her arrogant composure completely shattering into frantic panic. The remaining two heavily armed assassins rushed me simultaneously, their heavy, lethal boots stomping loudly against the ancient stones as they moved to trap me in the corner. The high contrast, flickering light from the roaring fireplace danced wildly across the room, desperately illuminating my only remaining chance for survival. I dove recklessly across the floor, my fingers desperately wrapping around the thick, heavy iron poker resting quietly beside the massive stone hearth. I swung the incredibly heavy metal rod upward with absolutely every single ounce of raw, unbridled strength I possessed in my small, exhausted frame. The solid iron connected violently with the side of the second assassin's helmet, producing a sickening, metallic crack that sent him crashing heavily into the heavy wooden wardrobe. My chest heaved frantically, my lungs burning for oxygen as I stood my ground, my white nightgown swirling around my legs like a ghostly, defiant banner of war. The final, largest assassin slowly circled me, his glowing, venomous sword raised high, his cruel eyes deeply calculating the precise angle for a completely fatal strike. "You put up a remarkably good fight for a pathetic, worthless piece of slum trash," he growled darkly, lunging forward with a terrifying, unstoppable burst of supernatural speed. I raised the iron poker to desperately block his brutal strike, but the sheer, overwhelming physical force of his blow violently shattered the metal right out of my bleeding hands. I stumbled backward, my spine hitting the cold, unyielding stone of the fireplace mantel, leaving me completely disarmed and absolutely cornered by death. The assassin raised his dripping silver blade for the final, lethal execution, an ugly, triumphant smirk twisting his scarred, shadowed face. But right in that terrifying, final fraction of a second, the swirling golden mating mark on my collarbone erupted into a blinding, searing, white-hot agony. It wasn't just my pain, it was a desperate, magical distress signal traveling at the speed of light directly into the highly volatile, completely unstable mind of the Alpha King. Before the poisoned blade could even begin its deadly descent, the entire wall containing the heavy oak bedroom doors literally exploded inward with catastrophic, deafening force. A massive, terrifying shockwave of pure, apocalyptic alpha dominance slammed violently into the room, instantly dropping the massive assassin straight to his shaking knees. Julian stood amidst the swirling dust and shattered, splintered wood, his impossibly broad chest heaving, his glowing golden eyes burning with a catastrophic, world-ending fury. He had never even made it to the military war room, he had felt my sheer, mortal terror through our sacred bond and had violently torn through his own castle to reach me. The towering, muscular Alpha King didn't speak a single, merciful word as he crossed the completely ruined bedroom in one terrifying, predatory blur of violent motion. He casually grabbed the kneeling assassin by the thick armor of his chest plate and effortlessly hurled him directly through the heavy, reinforced glass of the towering bedroom window. The horrifying, echoing screams of the doomed man faded rapidly as he plummeted hundreds of feet down into the freezing, unforgiving icy moat below the castle walls. Lady Alara was violently trembling on the floor, weeping hysterically and begging pathetically for mercy, her previous aristocratic arrogance completely erased by pure, primal terror. Julian completely ignored her pathetic, disgusting pleas, his intensely focused, burning gaze locked entirely onto my bruised, heavy-breathing form standing defiantly by the fire. He saw the shattered iron poker on the floor, the brutally scalded guard groaning in the corner, and the absolute, unbroken fire of fierce resilience still burning brightly in my eyes. I hadn't cowered helplessly in the corner waiting for my powerful mate to miraculously save me. I had viciously fought an entire assassination squad with nothing but a fireplace tool and sheer willpower. The terrifying, absolute fury in his striking face slowly, miraculously melted away, completely replaced by a profound, earth-shattering wave of awe and dark, obsessive pride. He walked slowly toward me, his heavy military boots crunching loudly over the shattered glass, and pulled my trembling, exhausted body fiercely into his solid, rock-hard chest. "I swear to you, my brave, magnificent Luna," he whispered darkly against my hair, his deep, gravelly voice trembling with a terrifying, absolute promise of mass destruction. "By nightfall, the blood of every single noble who dared to plot against you will permanently paint the ancient cobblestones of this entire godforsaken city." The deadly, inescapable game of royal politics had officially shifted from a quiet, whispered conspiracy into an open, bloody, and completely merciless war for absolute survival. The heavy, shattered remains of the oak doors crunched loudly beneath Julian's heavy military boots as he led me out of the ruined bedchamber. He did not release his incredibly possessive, iron grip on my waist, his massive, fiercely muscular frame acting as an impenetrable shield against the world. The harsh, high-contrast light from the blazing wall sconces cast long, intimidating shadows across his ruthlessly short dark hair and his sharp, unforgiving jawline. We descended the sweeping grand staircase, the suffocating, terrifying silence of the ancient castle completely broken only by the rhythmic, deadly thud of his steps. The sprawling, magnificent great hall was entirely packed with the terrified, trembling masses of the Northern Empire's proud and arrogant nobility. They had all been forcefully dragged from their luxurious quarters by the Alpha King's utterly loyal elite guard, violently forced to kneel on the cold marble. The metallic, sickly sweet stench of fresh blood completely overpowered the expensive, heavy perfumes that usually filled the opulent, vast royal court. At the absolute center of the room, Lady Alara was violently sobbing on the floor, surrounded by the heavily armed soldiers who had executed her entire treasonous household. Julian stopped on the final marble step, his towering, overwhelmingly dominant presence instantly crushing the remaining air out of the massive, terrified room. "You arrogant, pathetic fools honestly believed you could successfully scheme against my fated mate in the dark," his deep, rumbling, gravelly voice echoed with apocalyptic fury. His glowing, unnatural golden eyes swept slowly over the kneeling aristocrats, darkly promising a level of absolute, merciless destruction that would be written into their history. "This young woman possesses more raw, unbroken resilience and pure strength in her small frame than your entire pathetic, privileged bloodlines combined." He casually gestured toward the weeping, disgraced noble woman, his incredibly broad, athletic shoulders tight with an explosive, highly lethal tension. "Lady Alara dared to send a cowardly assassination squad into my sacred chambers to murder your rightful queen while I was away securing our fragile borders." A collective, horrifying gasp of pure panic rippled through the gathered crowd, many of the wealthy elites pressing their faces directly onto the freezing stone floor. I stood perfectly still beside my terrifying, supreme mate, my bloody nightgown catching the flickering, high-contrast firelight from the massive central hearth. My heart was hammering violently against my bruised ribs, but I absolutely refused to lower my chin or show even a single ounce of weakness to these monsters. I had barely survived the freezing, ruthless starvation of the outer slums, and I had just violently fought off a team of trained killers with my bare hands. I was entirely no longer the frightened, invisible orphan desperately hiding in the pitch-black shadows of the terrifying, chaotic mating ball. Julian suddenly released my waist, taking a slow, highly deliberate step forward, unsheathing his massive, glowing silver broadsword with a terrifying, metallic hiss. The ancient, unbreakable punishment for high treason against the ruling Alpha King and his sacred Luna is immediate, highly public, and absolute death. He raised the heavy, lethal weapon high into the air, the sharp silver blade catching the dramatic, fiery light like a divine instrument of pure, unadulterated vengeance. Lady Alara screamed a final, desperate plea for mercy, but the brutal, downward strike of his massive, highly muscular arm was infinitely faster than her pathetic words. The incredibly heavy silver blade cleanly severed her aristocratic head from her shoulders, sending a shocking, violent spray of crimson blood across the pristine white marble. The entire, massive room plunged into a state of sheer, absolute terror, with several high-ranking lords physically weeping in mortal fear of the Alpha's uncontrollable, savage wrath. Julian turned his striking, ruggedly handsome face back toward me, the violent, deadly spray of fresh blood contrasting sharply against his deeply tanned skin. His glowing, predatory eyes completely softened as he looked at me, silently offering me the absolute, undivided power of his entire terrifying, invincible empire. But I knew deep down in my fiercely independent soul that an empire entirely ruled by absolute, blind fear would eventually crumble into violent ashes. I took a slow, deeply confident step forward, willfully leaving the absolute, protective safety of his massive shadow to stand completely exposed before the terrified pack. The ancient, magical mating mark resting perfectly on my collarbone suddenly began to glow with a blinding, ethereal, and completely undeniable golden light. It was not just the terrifying, dark dominant power of the Alpha King, it was the sacred, deeply nurturing, and absolute authority of the true Luna finally awakening. A sudden, profound wave of calming, heavily grounding energy exploded violently outward from my small, bruised body, washing entirely over the panicking, weeping crowd. The frantic, terrified whimpering slowly died down as the ancient, magical bond forced every single wolf in the room to recognize my absolute, supreme sovereignty. The violent, cowardly wrath that festered in the dark corners of this royal court has been permanently severed from our pack tonight, I spoke, my voice ringing absolutely clear. My tone was not loud or aggressively roaring like Julian's, but it carried a quiet, undeniable, and fiercely absolute resilience that instantly demanded their complete attention. I may not have been born in a luxurious, safe palace, but I have bled willingly on these freezing stones to protect the sacred future of our powerful empire. I slowly met the terrified, wide eyes of the kneeling lords and ladies, intentionally letting them see the unbreakable, hardened steel forged by my years of past suffering. We will rebuild this proud nation, not upon a weak foundation of arrogant privilege and dark betrayals, but upon absolute loyalty and fierce, undeniable strength. Julian stepped silently up right behind me, his towering, highly imposing presence completely backing my bold, deeply unprecedented declaration to his ancient court. He slowly dropped heavily to one massive knee, bowing his striking, short dark hair and massively broad shoulders directly before my utterly shocked, trembling form. The most dangerous, ruthless, and completely undefeated Alpha King in the entire known world was publicly kneeling in absolute, willing submission to an orphaned slum girl. All hail the undisputed, incredibly fierce Luna of the Northern Empire, Julian roared passionately from the bloody floor, his powerful voice shaking the very foundations of the castle. Instantly, the entire vast sea of gathered nobility violently threw themselves completely flat onto the blood-stained marble, fiercely echoing his absolute, unquestionable command. The deafening, unified roar of their deep, frantic submission echoed endlessly through the ancient, high-contrast halls of the sprawling, magnificent Moonfire estate. The icy winter wind howled violently outside the thick, heavily reinforced stained glass windows, playing a perfect, dramatic symphony to the brutal justice served inside. Every single drop of innocent blood I had shed fighting in that dark, ruined bedchamber had successfully purchased my absolute, unshakable right to proudly rule them. Julian stood back up smoothly, his massive, heavily muscled arms wrapping securely around my waist once more, completely anchoring me to the absolute reality of my new life. His intoxicating, heavy scent of winter pine completely grounded my wildly racing thoughts, reminding me that I would absolutely never have to fight my brutal battles alone again. The dark, treacherous night of the deadly mating ball had forcefully torn my tragic, miserable old life entirely to shreds, leaving only this beautiful, terrifying destiny behind. I had finally claimed my absolute, undeniable place upon the high throne, but I knew the dangerous, looming war on the northern borders was still rapidly approaching our gates. The heavy, ominous war horns blew at the break of dawn, violently shaking the frost-covered windows of the magnificent Moonfire estate. Julian stood in the high-contrast shadow of the courtyard archway, his tall, immensely muscular frame clad entirely in dark, terrifying battle armor. His ruthlessly short hair caught the flickering orange light of the perimeter torches as he pulled me firmly against his solid chest. I must personally lead the vanguard to crush this rebellion at the frozen border, my brave Luna, he whispered, his golden eyes blazing with fierce reluctance. You hold the beating heart of this entire ancient empire in your delicate hands now, Elena. I gripped the cold metal plates of his heavy armor, absolutely refusing to let a single tear of weakness fall from my eyes. I will fiercely protect our home, Julian, and I will be waiting right here for your victorious return, I promised, my voice steady and deeply resolute. He captured my lips in a desperate, soul-consuming kiss that tasted intensely of bitter winter wind and absolute, possessive devotion. Then he was entirely gone, riding out rapidly with his massive army into the blinding white blizzard, leaving me to command the sprawling fortress. The true, terrifying test of my newfound authority began the very second the towering iron gates locked heavily behind his departing forces. A massive secondary faction of desperate rogue wolves had secretly bypassed the main border skirmish to violently strike directly at the capital. The dark, starless night sky suddenly erupted into terrifying chaos as thousands of flaming arrows rained down upon the ancient stone walls. The remaining aristocratic women shrieked in pure, unadulterated terror, frantically attempting to flee into the deep, fortified underground bunkers. Do not run and hide like frightened, pathetic prey. I shouted, my clear, commanding voice echoing powerfully across the chaotic, blood-stained courtyard. The magical golden mating mark on my collarbone flared with a brilliant, blinding heat, projecting my absolute lunar aura over the panicking crowd. We will stand our ground and fiercely fight for our survival, or we will absolutely all perish together in the burning ashes of this castle. The very same wealthy nobles who had brutally mocked my impoverished background just yesterday now looked at me with wide, completely awestruck eyes. I grabbed a discarded, heavy silver sword directly from the armory, my small, bruised hands gripping the ornate hilt with a fierce, unbreakable determination. I coldly ordered the terrified elite ladies to tear their expensive silk dresses into bandages to immediately treat the violently bleeding castle guards. I stood proudly at the very front of the burning wooden barricades, the dramatic, high-contrast glow of the raging fires illuminating my deeply resolute face. The heavy wooden gates groaned and violently splintered under the relentless, crushing impact of the rogue army's massive iron battering rams. Every single time the thick ancient wood cracked, my heart hammered a frantic rhythm, but my freezing feet remained planted firmly in the bloody snow. I was a hardened survivor of the cruelest, darkest outer slums, and I knew intimately how to bleed and fight viciously for every single breath I took. Through the pulsing, ancient magic of our unbroken mating bond, I could vividly feel Julian's catastrophic, world-ending rage echoing from miles away. He was currently fighting a brutal, unbelievably bloody war on the icy front lines, literally tearing through his enemies with unmatched, savage alpha dominance. Yet, he could distinctly feel my raw, physical terror and my fiercely unyielding courage as the castle gates finally gave way with an explosive, deafening crash. A terrifying, unstoppable flood of massive, snarling rogue wolves poured violently into the sacred royal courtyard, their yellow eyes glowing with dark murderous intent. "Hold the line!" I screamed at the top of my lungs, raising my heavy silver blade high as the remaining loyal guards instantly rallied around my small, defiant figure. The brutal, close-quarters combat instantly became a terrifying blur of flashing silver, spraying crimson blood, and deafening, agonizing screams of the dying. I swung my weapon desperately, using my incredibly small size and lightning-fast slum reflexes to perfectly dodge a massive, lethal claw swipe. A towering, heavily scarred rogue lunged directly at my throat, but I brutally drove my silver blade extremely deep into his unprotected chest without a single hesitation. I violently pulled the weapon free as the massive monster collapsed heavily into the red snow, my white dress completely soaked in the horrifying gore of endless battle. The aristocratic wolves fighting fiercely beside me roared in renewed, passionate fury, entirely inspired by the sheer, raw brutality of their slum-born queen. We were hopelessly outnumbered by the invading army, but the fierce, unbroken spirit of the Northern Empire burned much brighter than the catastrophic fires surrounding us. Suddenly, a massive, agonizing jolt of pure, white-hot magical energy shot directly through the glowing golden mark on my pale collarbone. It was Julian, desperately projecting his absolute, earth-shattering power across the vast, frozen distance to directly fortify my completely exhausted, battered muscles. I could hear his deep, highly gravelly voice roaring loudly inside my mind, desperately demanding that I survive, demanding that I hold my ground just a little longer. "I am still here, Julian," I whispered fiercely into the chaotic, bloody winter wind, my fighting soul completely intertwining with his across the burning landscape. The brutal, completely relentless waves of rogue attackers simply could not break the impenetrable, highly unified wall of loyal defenders rallied fiercely behind their Luna. We fought brutally through the darkest, most utterly terrifying hours of the endless night, entirely refusing to surrender our sacred home to the encroaching darkness. As the first faint, high-contrast rays of the morning dawn began to slowly pierce the heavy, black smoke, a new, entirely terrifying sound shook the bloody courtyard. It was absolutely not the panicked, dying screams of the defeated rogues, but the catastrophic, deafening howl of a supreme apex predator returning to violently claim his territory. The very earth violently trembled beneath our freezing, blood-soaked feet as the completely undisputed Alpha King finally broke through the burning tree line. His towering, athletic frame was absolutely bathed in the fresh blood of 1,000 fallen enemies, his golden eyes locked entirely upon his fiercely surviving mate. The blinding, high-contrast light of the rising morning sun violently tore through the thick, suffocating smoke of the burning Moonfire estate. Julian exploded into the heavily crowded courtyard like a catastrophic, unstoppable force of pure, uncontrollable nature. His towering, incredibly muscular body moved with a terrifying, supernatural speed that the terrified human eye could barely even follow. Every single rogue wolf that foolishly dared to step into his devastating path was instantly and violently crushed. His ruthlessly short dark hair was heavily matted with the crimson blood of his deeply unfortunate, arrogant enemies. He did not use a silver sword or a heavy iron shield, relying entirely on his massive, bare hands and his absolute alpha dominance. The remaining invading army, previously so arrogant and cruel, completely shattered under the apocalyptic, earth-shaking wrath of the true Northern King. Within absolute minutes, the deafening, chaotic sounds of the brutal battle were permanently silenced, replaced only by the mournful howling of the winter wind. I stood completely frozen amidst the bloody, ruined wooden barricades, my small, freezing hands still fiercely gripping my heavy, dulled silver blade. Julian slowly turned his striking, ruggedly handsome face toward me, his glowing golden eyes instantly softening from murderous rage to absolute, desperate relief. He dropped roughly to his heavily armored knees right in the middle of the devastated courtyard, completely ignoring the surrounding blood and soot. The most dangerous, undefeated monarch in the entire world opened his massive, protective arms wide, waiting silently for his fiercely loyal mate. I dropped my heavy, blood-stained weapon onto the cold stones and ran frantically across the ruined, deeply scarred winter snow. I threw my completely exhausted, battered body directly into his impossibly warm, rock-hard, and intensely familiar chest. His strong, heavily calloused hands wrapped fiercely around my trembling waist, lifting me effortlessly off the freezing ground as if I weighed absolutely nothing. The deeply intoxicating, overwhelming scent of winter pine and ancient embers completely enveloped my overloaded senses, bringing me instantly to warm, heavy tears. "You held our sacred home, my beautiful, endlessly resilient Luna," he whispered hoarsely into my tangled, dirty hair, his powerful body visibly shaking with emotion. "I told you I would absolutely never surrender without a brutal fight," I sobbed quietly, finally allowing the heavy emotional weight of the terrifying night to break me. He gently tilted my bruised chin up, the dramatic, high-contrast morning light perfectly catching the sharp, unforgiving line of his masculine jaw. Without another spoken word, his mouth crashed down heavily onto mine in a deep, soul-consuming, and utterly desperate kiss of pure survival. It was a fiery, intoxicating promise permanently forged in absolute blood, dark ash, and the ancient, unbreakable magic of our sacred bond. The swirling golden mating mark on my collarbone burned with a brilliant, blinding light, perfectly matching the sudden, answering heat radiating from his own chest. Every single surviving noble, heavily wounded guard, and terrified castle servant slowly fell to their knees in the bloody snow surrounding us. They were absolutely no longer bowing solely out of mortal fear of the Alpha King's terrifying, legendary, and highly destructive wrath. They were bowing in genuine, absolute reverence to the fierce, slum-born queen who had just bled willingly to desperately save their proud lives. I had spent my entire miserable youth desperately hiding in the freezing, pitch-black shadows, heavily believing I was completely worthless and eternally alone. Yet, destiny had violently dragged me into the blinding, terrifying light of this ancient, magical world to finally face my true, epic purpose. Julian pulled back slightly, resting his warm, strong forehead gently against mine as the heavy, pure white winter snow finally began to fall peacefully again. "You are the absolute beating heart of my empire now, Elena," he murmured passionately, his glowing golden eyes entirely filled with an eternal, unbreakable devotion. I looked out over the massive, kneeling pack in the smoking, ruined remains of the grand, ancient castle we would soon slowly rebuild together. I was absolutely no longer just a helpless orphan, and I was far more than just a stolen, accidental mate found hiding in the dark. I was the true, undisputed Luna of the entire Northern Empire, and my legendary, immortal reign of fierce resilience had only just truly begun. From an anonymous orphan in the slums to a commanding queen who brought an entire empire to its knees. The intense push and pull between Elena and the Wolf King, Julian, has finally reached its triumphant conclusion. If you love this kind of electrifying, empowering heroine saga, featuring themes of mistaken identity, size difference, and absolute devotion, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the notification bell. Let's discuss, throughout the entire story, which moment did you find to be Julian's most swoon-worthy and commanding? Was it his thunderous arrival in the underground tunnels, or the moment he knelt before her in the Grand Hall? Tell me your thoughts in the comments section below. See you in our next viral story.